3,000 women at the edge of a cliff. That is the image most people remember. The palace has fallen. The enemy has entered Sabi. The king has lost his kingdom. Somewhere above the river, women of the court are said to choose death rather than capture. Their robes fall like flowers. The cliff becomes Nakwaam, the rock of falling flowers. The story becomes tragic and impossible to forget. For centuries, that image has followed the last king of Baekje. King Uija, the 31st ruler of Baekje, is remembered as the king who lost everything because he was drunk on pleasure, surrounded by palace women, deaf to loyal ministers, and blind to the danger gathering outside his walls. It is powerful. It is also suspiciously convenient, because when a kingdom falls, the victors inherit more than its fortresses. They inherit the right to explain why it deserved to fall. They can turn military defeat into moral judgment, and a complex collapse into one bad king and one unforgettable scandal. The story of the 3,000 court ladies may preserve fear and grief after Sabi fell, but the exact number is not supported by contemporary evidence in the way later legend suggests. The image grew powerful because it did what political memory often does. It made defeat feel morally explainable. So the real question is not only, did 3,000 women leap from a cliff? The deeper question is, why did history need King Uija to be remembered that way? Because the man behind the legend was not simply weak. In the early years of his reign, he was praised as filial and virtuous. He was called the Haedong Zengzi, the Zengzi of the Eastern Sea, a reference to one of the great models of Confucian filial devotion. He attacked Silla with force. In 642, Baekje captured Daya Fortress, a key Silla western stronghold. More than 40 Silla fortresses fell. That victory changed the future of the peninsula. At Daya, Kim Pum-suk, a Silla commander and the son-in-law of Kim Chunchu, died. So did his wife, Go Ta-so. For Kim Chunchu, the loss was personal. It helped push him toward the decision that would doom Baekje, seek an alliance with Tang China. Less than 20 years later, Baekje faced something no single Korean kingdom could easily withstand. Tang general Su Dingfang came by sea with a force recorded as 130,000. Shilla's Kim Yushin advanced with 50,000. Between them stood Baekje, weakened by court division, ignored warnings, and fatal misjudgment. This is not a story about proving Uija innocent. He was warned, he failed to listen. Ministers like Sung Chun and Hun Su told him where the enemy must be stopped. Tan Hyun and Gyebaek Po. He exiled them. When the invasion came, those warnings sounded less like advice and more like prophecy. But it is also not a story about pleasure destroying a kingdom by itself. Baekje fell because strategy failed, because diplomacy shifted, because Silla found Tang, because Tang wanted power across the sea, because Baekje's victories created enemies more dangerous than the enemies it had defeated. History remembered Uija as a villain. The real man was more useful than that. He was capable, he was dangerous, he was praised, he was warned, he was wrong, and when he lost, the story that survived made his failure look simpler than it was. Before the cliff, before the palace fell, before Baekje became a memory, there was a prince with a very different reputation. Uija was the son of King Mu of Baekje. When he came to the throne in 641, he did not arrive in the records as a monster. The surviving tradition says that, while still a prince, he was known for filial devotion. The phrase attached to him, Haedong Zengzi, matters. Zengzi was not a warrior model. He was not a symbol of luxury or violence. He was a Confucian figure remembered for moral conduct, especially for devotion to parents. To compare a prince of Baekje to him was to say something serious about character. We should be careful. Courtly praise is never neutral. A new king benefits from being presented as dutiful, harmonious, and fit to rule. The title may tell us as much about royal politics as about private virtue. But that is exactly why it matters. The later image of Uija as a ruined, pleasure-soaked king was not the only image available. His memory had to travel from filial prince to aggressive king, to ruler who ignored warnings, to defeated captive, to villain of a fallen kingdom. That movement is the story. Baekje in the 7th century was not a dying state waiting quietly for its end. It was one of the 3 kingdoms, proud of its culture, connected to the sea, and deeply involved in the politics of East Asia. Its capital at Sabi, in present-day Buyeo, was the center of Buddhist temples, aristocratic lineages, military networks, and diplomacy across the water. But Baekje was also under pressure. Silla was growing stronger. Gogu Ryu remained a major force in the north. Tang China had replaced earlier dynasties and was becoming one of the great imperial powers of the age. The Korean peninsula was not isolated. It was part of a wider world where local wars could become international wars very quickly. When Uija took the throne, he faced a problem every late Baekje king had to face. Baekje had lost its old Han River heartland to Silla generations earlier. That loss was not only territorial. It cut at prestige, trade, military depth, and royal memory. A king who wanted to restore Baekje's strength could not simply defend, he had to push. Uija pushed. In the first years of his reign, the record does not show a helpless ruler lost in pleasure. It shows a king willing to use force, and able, at least for a time, to make Silla suffer. He moved against Shilla's western defenses. He tightened pressure along the frontier. He appears in these early years as a ruler trying to restore Baekje's strategic position before Silla became too strong to contain. This is where the later moral story becomes too small. If we begin with the 3,000 court ladies, Uija is already a failed king. Everything that came before becomes only a prelude to shame. But if we begin in 641 with a newly enthroned ruler, praised for filial virtue and eager to reclaim power, the story changes. It becomes more uncomfortable. Because the tragedy of Uija is not that a foolish man was foolish from the start. The tragedy is that a king who could act decisively also made decisions that helped create the conditions of his destruction. His strength and his failure were not separate chapters. They belonged to the same reign. The early Uija was not an argument for his innocence. He was the reason his fall would matter. In 642, Baekje struck Silla hard. The target that mattered most was Daeya Fortress. It stood in what is now Hupcheon, a key stronghold in Shilla's western defenses. Whoever controlled Daeya could threaten the roots into Shilla's interior. For Silla, it was not just another border fort, it was a shield. Baekje broke it. The fall of Daeya was one of Uija's greatest military successes. Around the same period, Baekje forces took more than 40 Silla fortresses. The number itself is dramatic, but even if we read ancient figures cautiously, the strategic meaning is clear. Uija's Baekje was not passively declining. It was attacking, winning, and forcing Silla to confront the possibility that Baekje might become too dangerous to manage. At Daeya, the story becomes personal. The Silla commander Kim Pumsuk was killed. His wife, Gotaso, was also killed. She was the daughter of Kim Chunchu, the man who would later become King Taejongmuyo of Silla. When a fortress falls, a state loses soldiers, walls, stores, and territory. But sometimes it also creates a wound that changes policy. Daeya did that. For Kim Chunchu, Baekje was no longer only a rival kingdom. Baekje had entered his household. It had killed his daughter and son-in-law. The records preserve Kim Chunchu's grief in different ways, and later storytelling has every reason to sharpen that grief into destiny. Still, the political consequence is hard to ignore. After Daeya, Chunchu searched for help beyond Silla. He went first toward Gogu Ryu, where the answer was not what he needed. Eventually, he turned to Tang. This is one of the great ironies of Uija's reign. His early victories weakened Silla, restored Baekje's pride, and showed that the new king could fight. but they also helped create the urgency that made Silla willing to bind itself to Tang power. A victory can be strategically brilliant and strategically dangerous at the same time. That is the kind of complexity the later villain story cannot hold. If Uija is simply decadent, then Daeya becomes an exception, an early flash before decline. But if we take his reign seriously, Daeya becomes the turning point that made Baekje look dangerous enough to destroy. Silla alone had reasons to fear Baekje. Tang had reasons of its own. Tang was building imperial influence across East Asia. Gogu Ryu remained a major obstacle in the northeast, and Baekje's position mattered to the larger military picture. A Silla-Tang alliance promised both sides something. Silla could remove Baekje, its immediate enemy. Tang could project power into the peninsula and reshape the balance against Gogu Ryu. Uija did not cause Tang ambition by winning at Daeya. That would be too simple. But Daeya changed Shilla's calculation. It made compromise less attractive, outside help more urgent, and gave Kim Chunchu both a strategic argument and a personal one. That is why the fall of Daeya is so important. It was not merely one Baekje triumph on the road to collapse. It was a victory that rearranged the emotional and diplomatic map of the peninsula. Baekje won the fortress. Silla began searching for the weapon that would one day break Baekje itself. The winner of the battle had made an enemy with a longer memory than he understood. A kingdom rarely falls because no one saw danger coming. More often, someone sees it. Someone says the thing that needs to be said. Someone warns the king that the road ahead is not the road he thinks it is. In the final years of Baekje, two names carry that burden: Song Chung and Hung Su. They are remembered as loyal ministers, the kind of figures later history loves, because they make disaster feel avoidable. Their warnings come down through sources that already know Baekje has fallen, so we should read them carefully. But the substance of the warning makes military sense. If a Silla-Tang invasion came, Baekje had to control the routes by which the enemy would enter. Tanhyun, the mountain pass, and Gyebaek, the river or coastal entry point associated with Baekje's western approach, mattered because they were not symbolic places. They were gates. If the enemy passed them, the kingdom's defense would become much harder. Sung Chung is said to have warned that the Tang and Silla forces must be stopped at those points. He was not offering vague morality. He was identifying choke points. He was telling the king that geography would decide the war before courage did. Uija did not listen. Sung Chung fell from favor and died, remembered as a loyal man whose advice went unheard. Hung Su, too, is remembered as offering warning from exile. The detail is painful. A man already pushed away from the court still thinks about the kingdom's survival. He still tells them where to defend. He still understands what the palace cannot afford to misunderstand. Here, Uija's responsibility becomes real. We do not need the legend of 3,000 court ladies to criticize him. We do not need to imagine him as a caricature of pleasure. The historical charge is serious enough. When confronted with the warnings of experienced officials, he chose not to use them well. Whether because of arrogance, factional distrust, overconfidence, or a belief that earlier victories had proven his judgment, he failed at one of the essential duties of kingship. He failed to hear what was true because he did not like who was saying it. That kind of failure is common in history. It is also deadly. Still, even here we must be careful not to make the story too easy. If Uija had listened perfectly, Baekje might still have faced overwhelming danger. Tang's expedition was massive. Shilla's army was experienced and determined. The alliance was designed to strike Baekje from more than one direction, to force speed, confusion, and collapse. A better defense might have delayed defeat. It might have made the invasion more costly. It might even have changed negotiations. But it would not have erased the structural problem. Baekje was facing two enemies acting together. One was a Korean rival that knew the land and had a direct stake in revenge. The other was an empire with naval reach. manpower, and the confidence of a rising Tang court. That is why the warnings matter so much. They show both sides of the truth. Uija was not destroyed only by slander. He made errors, and his treatment of loyal counsel deserves the weight later history gave it. But Baekje was not destroyed only by one man's moral weakness. Even if we strip away the legend, even if we remove every embroidered image of palace excess, the military reality remains severe. The tragedy is not that no one knew what had to be defended. The tragedy is that, by the time the warnings became undeniable, the enemy was already moving. In 660, the storm arrived from two directions. Tang General Su Dingfang crossed the sea with a force recorded as 130,000. Ancient numbers can carry political weight, but the message is clear. This was not a raid. It was an imperial expedition. At the same time, Silla moved with its own army, traditionally given as 50,000 under Kim Uija. Kim Uija was not merely a commander. He was one of Shilla's defining military figures, tied to the rise of Kim Chunchu and the strategy that would transform the peninsula. Baekje now faced the result of decisions made over decades. Its old rivalry with Silla had become part of Tang's strategy. Its earlier successes had not secured safety. They had helped convince Silla that Baekje could not be contained without outside power. Its warnings had been mishandled. Its court was divided. Its defensive geography, the passes and river mouths that should have slowed the invasion, had not been used with the clarity Sung Chung and Hung Su had urged. War, when it finally comes, often looks sudden, but the conditions that make it fatal are usually built slowly. For Baekje, the danger was speed. Tang's force came by sea toward the western approaches. Silla advanced by land. If the two armies could link or coordinate effectively, Baekje would have to divide its attention. A kingdom can survive one invasion by concentrating force. It can sometimes survive two if its interior lines are strong and its command system works. But if the enemy controls the tempo, every delay becomes a wound. The court in Sabi had to decide where to fight, whom to trust, and how to protect the capital. Those are hard decisions, even in a healthy state. They are harder in a court where loyal ministers have been exiled, where factions may distrust one another, and where the king's judgment has already been damaged by his refusal to hear unwelcome advice. This is the moment when the later moral legend becomes most tempting. It is easier to say that the king was lost in pleasure, and therefore the kingdom fell. It is harder to hold the actual picture. A capable but flawed ruler, a wounded Silla leadership, a Tang empire projecting force, and a Baekje defense that needed precision at exactly the wrong moment. The sources we have are not neutral windows. The Samguk Saji was compiled centuries later in Goryeo, using earlier materials shaped by Shilla's victory. Tang histories, including the Old Book of Tang and the New Book of Tang, preserve the imperial side, a successful expedition against a foreign kingdom. Neither perspective should be thrown away. Neither should be swallowed whole. Read together, they show the scale of Baekje's crisis. Silla had local knowledge and revenge. Tang had imperial reach and the prestige of conquest, commanders, walls, and a long tradition of statecraft. But courage and walls cannot replace strategic timing. That timing had already begun to fail. The invasion did not need Uija to be a cartoon villain. It needed him to be late, isolated, and wrong where it mattered most. That was enough. By the time Baekje made its stand at Hwangsanbeol, the most important decisions had already been made. That is what makes the battle so painful. It was not the first gate. It was not where Baekje's strategy should have begun. It was the place where courage had to pay for failures that had happened earlier, in council rooms, in ignored warnings, in the refusal to defend the route Sung Chung and Hung Su had named. The name remembered from Hwangsanbeol is Gyebaek. According to tradition, he led 5,000 Baekje soldiers against a much larger Silla army under King Uija. The contrast became part of memory, 5,000 against 50,000. Baekje fought fiercely, repelling Silla 4 times before exhaustion and numbers finally broke the line. Gyebaek deserves his place in memory. But in this story, he should not replace Uija as the center. He should make Uija harder to look away from. Because Gyebaek's loyalty tells us something important about Baekje's final days. The kingdom was not empty of courage. It was not a hollow court with no one left willing to die for it. At the end, Baekje could still produce commanders and soldiers who stood in front of a larger army until the situation swallowed them. That fact destroys the easiest version of the 3,000 court ladies story. If Baekje had fallen only because the king loved pleasure and the court had gone soft, Hwangsanbeol would not have become one of Korea's great last stands. But the same fact also deepens Uija's responsibility. A king is not judged only by whether loyal men exist under him. Loyal men can exist under bad judgment. Brave soldiers can die inside a strategy that has already failed. A commander can hold a field for a day and still be trapped by decisions made far from the battlefield. Gyebaek's loyalty does not rescue Uija's reputation. It exposes the cost of Uija's failure. The king had men who would fight. He had officials who had warned him. He had fortified terrain and people still willing to stand. What he no longer had was time. The enemy had taken the tempo. Silla was moving. Tong was pressing from the west. By the time Gyebaek stood at Hwangsanbeol, Baekje was no longer choosing the shape of the war. It was reacting to a shape already forced upon it. That is the trap Uija was inside. And, in a harsher sense, it was the trap he had helped build. His early victories had made Silla's fear sharper. His treatment of loyal counsel had weakened the court's ability to respond clearly. His failure to trust the right warnings meant that the bravery of others had to carry the burden of royal misjudgment. After 4 clashes, the Baekje line broke. Gyebaek died. The road towards Sabi opened. For Uija, it was the sound of the last shield cracking. Somewhere in Sabi, the king who had once been praised as Haedong Zengzi was no longer the aggressive ruler of 642. He was waiting inside a shrinking world. The captured fortresses, the court titles, the pride of Baekje's long history, all of it was being compressed into a few days of military collapse. And outside, men were dying for a kingdom whose king had not listened when listening still mattered. That sentence is hard, but it is necessary. To complicate Uija's memory is not to excuse him. Hung Su and Sung Chung still stand in the record. Tan Hyun and Gyebaek Po still stand as warnings. Hwangsanbeol still stands as the place where loyalty could not repair strategy. Uija's tragedy is that his defenders were more loyal at the end than he had been wise before it. The truth sits between legend and defense, in the space where a king can be both misremembered and responsible. When Sabi fell, Baekje did not only lose a capital, it lost the place from which its world made sense. Sabi had been the royal center since the 6th century, a city tied to Baekje's Buddhist culture, aristocratic order, and diplomatic life. To lose it was not like losing one fortress among many. It was the collapse of the stage on which Baekje kingship had performed itself. Uija fled, then surrendered. The exact sequence differs by record, but the outcome is clear. Baekje's king was taken by Tong. Along with him went members of the royal family, high officials, generals, and many others. Tong histories frame the event as conquest. Korean records remember it as the end of a kingdom. Uija was sent to Loyang. There, far from Sabi, he died in 661. That exile matters. A king who dies in his own capital can still be surrounded by the geography of his ancestors. A king who dies in the victor's imperial city becomes a trophy even in death. His body is no longer in the world that made him king. Its final chapter belongs to someone else's map. And after the fall, memory began its own work. This is where the 3,000 court ladies returned. The story of women leaping from Nakwaam is powerful because it gives the fall of Baekje a single image of irreversible loss. It turns conquest into a scene the mind can hold. It also turns the moral blame toward the palace. If there were thousands of women there, the king must have been indulgent. If the women died in a beautiful mass tragedy, the kingdom's end becomes aesthetic, emotional, and morally legible. But historians have long questioned the number and the way the story developed. The lack of a clear contemporary record for 3,000 court ladies does not mean no women suffered when Sabi fell. Of course they did. Palace women, aristocratic families, servants, captives, and civilians would all have faced terror in the aftermath of conquest. What is doubtful is the clean legendary form, the exact number, the dramatic cliff scene, the way it came to define Uija's reign, as if that image explained the entire collapse. This is how defeated kings are often remembered. Their military failures become moral failures. Their moral failures become sexual failures. Their sexual failures become proof that the conquest was deserved. The last king of a fallen state is made to carry the sins of the whole ending on his body. Uija was vulnerable to that process because he really had failed in visible ways. He ignored loyal counsel. He lost the war. He became a captive. Those facts made the later moralizing story easier to attach. But the attachment is not the same as truth. The fall of Baekje was not the result of a single cliff, a single rumor, or a single palace indulgence. It was the result of military pressure, diplomatic isolation, bad decisions, court distrust, and a Silla-Tong alliance, powerful enough to break one of Korea's ancient kingdoms. The women of the legend should not be used as decoration. They should make us ask why defeat so often demands a scandal before people are willing to understand it. The MBC drama Gyebaek places Baekje's final years on screen through a loyal general, a doomed kingdom, and a court that could not save itself. It works because Baekje's ending already contains everything tragedy needs: warning, pride, courage, bad timing, and grief that arrives too late. But when we step back from drama and return to the records, Uija remains difficult to hold. He was not the innocent victim of hostile historians. He was also not merely the decadent monster later memory needed him to be. He was praised for filial virtue, remembered as Haedong Zengzi. He struck Silla hard enough to capture Daeya and dozens of fortresses. His victory helped push Kim Chunchu toward Tong. He was warned by Sungchung and Hongsu. He did not listen. His general, Gyebaek, died with 5,000 men at Hwangsanbeol. Uija died in Luoyang, far from the kingdom he had lost. That is not a simple villain. It is worse and more human. A simple villain teaches us very little. He falls because he deserves to fall. The world becomes clean. The lesson becomes easy. Do not be greedy. Do not be lustful. Do not ignore good men. Those lessons are not wrong, but they are too small for Baekje. Baekje did not fall only because one king became morally weak. It fell because a regional balance changed, because Silla found Tong, because Baekje's early victories hardened Shilla's resolve, because the court failed to use loyal counsel, and because courage at Hwangsanbeol could not repair strategy after the gates had opened. The story of the 3,000 court ladies survived because it gave all of that complexity a single image: a cliff, a river, falling robes, a ruined king. It is unforgettable, but unforgettable is not the same as complete. If we look only at Nakwaam, we see the ending later storytellers could use. If we look earlier, we see a king who once seemed capable of restoring Baekje's strength. At Daeya, victory plants disaster. With Sungchung and Hongsu, ignored truth becomes fatal. With Gyebaek, loyalty survives even when leadership fails. And if we look at Uija in Luoyang, dying in the land of the empire that conquered him, we see the final loneliness of a defeated king. History often needs the loser to become an explanation. It needed Uija to explain Baekje's fall, so it remembered the pleasure, the women, the ignored ministers, the cliff. Some of that may hold fragments of truth. Some may be moral judgment. Some may be victory speaking through history. Our task is not to erase the judgment, it is to make it honest. Uija was not a hero waiting to be rescued from slander. He was a ruler whose early strength helped create the danger he later failed to meet. He was not only the king of the 3,000 court ladies, he was the king of Deya, of ignored warnings, of Hwangsanbeol, of Sabi, and of exile. The last king of Baekje was not simple. That may be why history made him look simple, because a complicated defeat is hard to remember.